One of the things I've noticed comes up, especially with moral scrupulosity OCD, is someone actually might find that the pause in their obsessional thinking can be the trigger for another episode of moral scrupulosity OCD. Here's what I mean by that. Some people carry this belief that being a moral person really does require that vigilance. It requires them to be always sort of being self-reflective in the deepest way, always considering and weighing how moral they're being.
Welcome to OCD Whisperer podcast. Today with me, I have Dr. Rachel LaFleur, who's a psychologist based in Maryland, who also provides telehealth to most states via PsychPat authorization. She offers care to children, adolescents, and adults, drawing from a variety of evidence-based treatments and approaching care with flexibility and warmth. Dr. LaFleur's passion for OCD treatment is fueled by her interest in our evolving understanding of OCD, which demands self-reflective practice, close collaboration with colleagues and patients, and critical thinking about treatment mechanisms and the factors responsible for meaningful and lasting change. I love that. Welcome to the show.
Kristina, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So for us and for the audience, would you prefer Rachel or Dr. LaFleur?
Rachel works great. Thank you so much for asking.
I don't know. Everybody's a little different, but yeah. So, just for anybody listening, we actually met at the ADAA conference, the Anxiety Depression Association of America, I think a year ago now. Maybe
I can't even keep track of the time.
Yeah,
but
I'm like, there's so many conferences.
I just remember you just shine, Kristina. You're an easy one to pick out of a crowd at a conference in that way. And you're very good at making connections. So in true form, we connected and here I am.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, one of the things I loved is we talked about, running a group practice. I was picking your brain because I'm considering it. But the thing today that we want to dive into, and I wanted to have you on the show to discuss, is moral scrupulosity. So anybody listening today, if you have OCD, you might, if you don't know this, go, what the heck is that? And so we're going to dive into what that is. So go and ahead and take it away, Rachel.
Sure. So moral scrupulosity is a theme that some people have in terms of their OCD. And thinking about it, some people are hyper sort of focused on the idea of, am I a good person? In that, they might be looking at past behavior or current behavior or decisions and thinking through, how did I or didn't I show up as a good person? There can be this like fixation on it, revisiting, replaying, confessing, asking for reassurance. And to give some examples of that, someone even looking for a job may be thinking, depending on what job I take, in what ways is that contributing or taking from the world? Really looking for the sense of almost moral purity in that decision. Or someone else might be on vacation and they maybe purchase a single-use plastic water bottle and they might get really focused on, oh my gosh, I bought that water bottle and then, I didn't even recycle it. I threw it away. There wasn't recycling bin. What does that mean about me? Am I someone who doesn't try hard enough? Because I think when it comes to morality, there's this idea that people need to really open their eyes. I got to keep my eyes open. You have to be vigilant if you're going to be a good person. And so people with moral scrup OCD really can go pretty far with that.
Yeah, as you're talking, I've definitely had clients that were very focused on that and kind of doing the right thing, the moral thing. And, if somebody's listening, so one thing that sticks out right now that I'm sure somebody might have a question around is when you're talking about like this focus of doing the right thing, what's the difference then between like this kind of just right perfectionism OCD? Because that has some of that element of, doing the just things just right versus the morality piece.
And I guess what I would say with that is moral scrupulosity is involved in a lot of themes of OCD. It's not, there's overlap between them. So whether we're talking about just right OCD or contamination OCD, and I'll go into contamination OCD as just another example of this, moral scrupulosity shows up. So someone with contamination OCD who might be really fixated on the idea of coming into contact with germs, getting sick, maybe the reason they care about it is, what if I'm not a responsible person and I pass it on to other people, I make them sick, doesn't that make me a bad person? So whether it be just right OCD, contamination contamination OCD, real event OCD, moral scrupulosity can oftentimes find its way in there. And so what I would encourage people to do is to sort of think flexibly about their OCD and recognize that they might have a sprinkle of sort of different themes, and to work really closely with their provider to understand how their OCD is showing up, and that being maybe more important than classifying it.
Yeah. And, when we talk about morality, I think it begs the question of, some of the things that influence this, right? Because when I historically have thought about this, like from just society at large, right? Like morally, it's like we have some kind of moral codes almost, right? Like there's these things that are right that we should do, or if you are a good person, or if you're conscientious or kind, right? And you don't do these other things, or these other things are immoral or bad or shameful. And, if you have OCD brain, right, you can definitely fixate on anything. I always say, like, whatever your favorite topic of the hour is, right, OCD will grab onto it. But, with morality, I guess the other piece is around, like, what are some, and I know you mentioned some examples, but can we go a little bit more deeper with it in terms of other ways that somebody maybe not as obvious to them, but how they might be experiencing this? Because I think one of the things I know, like I struggled with for a long time, like I didn't realize I had OCD until later years, because I didn't know that there's this way it can show up where, like, for example, in my case, one of the obvious things was, well, now obvious, like with friends, like, oh, like, okay, to be a really good friend, or, like, okay, I have to make sure I'm always checking in, or like I'm always there for them, or, right. Like it was this idea that was driving it about, the right way of being a friend, like a good friend, like this morality piece, as well as, of course, this just right relationship component. So it did have a different mixture in there, but there was this drive about, being a good person. And then, of course, any mistake that I would make, and of course I would, because I'm human, right? Yes. Then it was this intense reaction, over the top, and, an insane amount of guilt and shame, and just feeling like you have a big bag of bricks on you. And, totally constantly feeling like, oh, are you okay? Are you mad at me? Are you mad at me? I mean, to the point where my friends were like, girl, you got, like, what is going on with you? Stop it. Yeah. Right. Yes. So, like, that's something, for example, that's not obvious. Right. And we don't talk about that kind of stuff. So is there other things like that or examples you have?
Well, number one, I just want to point out there, you're describing like a hypervigilance, that it's taking just so much energy to fuel this thing, and so much energy that a person may be neglecting other things that matter to them, other values that they have. And they might even be so focused even on being a good friend that in a way that they're actually not being as good of a friend they could be, because they're going so far with it. And so I love that example you provided. I think there are so many examples of this, and I'll even go into one that I've noticed in cases that by identifying this as part of the pattern has really helped people make progress when they previously could not. One of the things I've noticed comes up, especially with moral scrupulosity OCD, is someone actually might find that the pause in their obsessional thinking can be the trigger for another episode of moral scrupulosity OCD. Here's what I mean by that. Some people carry this belief that being a moral person really does require that vigilance. It requires them to be always sort of being self-reflective in the deepest way, always considering and weighing how moral they're being. And if you carry that belief, if you actually slow down or pause your obsessional thinking, either because you burn out from it and necessarily have to take a break, or even in treatment, a clinician is encouraging you to be more flexible and to pause a little bit. For someone with this belief, then they're thinking, oh my gosh, like, I'm not showing up as caring enough about morality. Here's the evidence. Here's the evidence. Like, look at me ignoring my responsibility for being a good person in the world. I've always been told that being a good person requires you to be like very aware. And this lack of awareness means I'm a bad person. So here goes the next episode of OCD. And so I think like that is an often neglected part of the pattern. And when people realize that, then treatment is something that they can approach more readily, because now when they're engaging in treatment, they're approaching that they can kind of cope in advance for that moment when their OCD is like, hey, you're not paying close enough attention. This means you're a bad person. And so I think that I love that question, and it helps me remember that. I think the other thing that just kind of shows up too, that becomes a barrier for some folks, is when regardless of which modality you're using, I think people with moral scrupulosity still want to engage in self-reflection about who they are, who they want to be, and how they're showing up in the world. And I think really effective treatment helps people to do that without involving OCD in that process. And I think sometimes when we're just focusing on reducing OCD, we don't always help people to pick up, like, there's an intention for why they were doing that. How do you do that in a way that actually serves you and actually does get you the information on yourself that's more evidenced in terms of your morality?
Yeah, as we're diving into this topic, so something that comes to mind that I know a lot of people struggle with, and I definitely get this in my DMs and folks reach out consistently enough for me to basically pick your brain right now about this, which is, what do you think people can do? Because there's plenty of people in the world who really can't afford and don't have access to getting help, right? And they're struggling. I mean, I get messages constantly about people really struggling, and it's heartbreaking. And I wish I could, treat everybody and help everybody. Obviously, we can't single-handedly, hence, why I'm doing this podcast and trying to bring education. But what would you say, kind of, if we go through like a tier, if we think of a tier model, what would be something like, what could be a first step somebody could do if they're in a place in the world or wherever they are in life or world where, let's say, they can't financially get anything? What could they do to start at least this process? And then what could be the second step if there's, let's say, they could invest some lower amount into something, right? And the next step to, like, something like that.
I love this question, Kristina. I don't have the link at the top of my mind, but there is actually a link if you're able to attach it to this podcast would be great, maybe in the notes. But there are, let me back up here. There's self-help resources, and there's a certain organization that vets them to make sure that they're evidence-based. I think in a world of self-help, where, for example, people are purchasing a self-help course or a self-help book, there's a lot of variety. And in some ways that variety is great, but if it's someone's first step in the OCD treatment and they're still sort of familiarizing themselves with evidence-based treatments, it can be really nice at least to start in a place that research says could really pay you back, is likely to have a positive effect. And so I'll make sure to send that to you after our recording today.
Yes, please.
So that
I've never heard of that.
And then that way, whether it be OCD, whether it be anxiety, whether it be a body-focused repetitive behavior or something else, it's this, again, a vetted, essentially, database. It doesn't include every book, though. And there are evidence-based self-help books that probably don't make it in there. But again, a really good first step.
Yeah, that's awesome. I literally, and I didn't mean to interrupt you earlier, but I've never heard of that process. And I think that's awesome.
Offer that then.
Yeah, I think that's really great. Just for people to, I mean, of course, there are a lot of great resources, but even if something didn't make it there, it's still nice to know there is something that at least does that kind of heavy lifting for you. And then, of course, people can find other options. All right, cool. What would be the next step
along those lines? I've also just noticed, like, people like you, Kristina, there are people who have thoughtful social media accounts and podcasts that bring on clinicians, researchers, people who have hopefully expertise and wisdom in the area, and also folks with lived experience, also really important resource, and has people having these rich conversations. And I think what that does is it builds a framework for people of what is it that I'm experiencing and what are the important mechanisms for treatment. Then I think people, especially people who are really good at some sort of self-reflection, can get through those early stages of at least accounting for, where is OCD showing up in my life and how is it getting in the way of things? And what are some things that I can do about it? And so I think, especially if you're sort of giving yourself a chance to grow in that way, at first it can be overwhelming. At first you can be wondering if you're doing it right. And that's all okay. But if you can kind of move through it flexibly and sort of let it marinate, sometimes you'll hear the same idea, maybe in a new way. And in that time it sticks. And then over time, you're sort of really building your own knowledge base and your own skill set.
Yeah. So self-help would be the first piece. And like you said, right, getting yourself that education or this website you're going to share with me, which I'm excited for. Just learning about what OCD is, how it shows up. So what could somebody do if, let's say, they have a little bit of money to spend? What would you suggest or recommend?
I offer, but there are some people who offer support groups which can be lower cost, or treatment groups. And if people can find one of those, they can be lower cost than individual therapy. Essentially, the group of participants are sharing the cost for that clinician's time. And you're meeting people who you want, number one, you can relate to, as well as number two, people who can offer guidance for what's worked for them with a clinician there who can sort of help people sift through different ideas and material and really kind of keep things pointed in an evidence-based direction.
And did I just hear you right? You said you offer some of that. Tell me about yours.
I don't. I wish I did. I don't offer that. But for people who can find those groups, it can be a really helpful service.
Okay.
Groups are one of the things that we find, especially, are really valuable, but hard to get off the ground. So there are not enough of them.
Yeah, for sure. And then what would you kind of say the next step after that is? If somebody, let's say, is able to pay or afford things?
There's, for people who are wanting, for example, to use their insurance, and unfortunately within the field, there are not, enough people who are accepting insurance to work with OCD. There are, NoCD is an organization that accepts a lot of the major insurance plans and has a national presence. So if you're in the United States, NoCD can be a good option. And then from there, I think sometimes when you're contacting someone for treatment in your area, maybe NoCD doesn't feel like a fit, or they don't maybe offer the treatment you're looking for. I think if you're willing to be persistent and get in contact with someone who can help point you in the right direction. One of the things I try to do when people contact me is, if for some reason I'm not a fit because of insurance or otherwise, I'm really trying to help identify who they could be a fit with. And so I think for people who, if you're saying, oh, this isn't a fit for financial reasons, go ahead and ask, hey, do you know someone who takes my insurance? Hey, are you aware of anyone who has sliding scale? And they might be able to connect you to the next person. I will say that clinicians can get bombarded with calls or messages. And so I do really think being persistent in this, being patient and flexible as you go about it, understanding that it's not just you they're not getting back to, they're not meaning to frustrate you that way, and just kind of use that to gather the information.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you mentioned a sliding scale. Absolutely. It's always worth to ask because, every practice, usually, not always, but may have a certain amount of slots allocated for a sliding scale option. Or there might be, if it's a group practice, maybe there's an intern that might be at a little bit of a lower fee.
Really good point.
So that's great. I think other things I'll add in there too that I'm aware of, and I'm constantly trying to, learn this, but there's different kind of also courses that people can get. Like I know Nathan Peterson, OCD Anxiety Online does those. I know Jenna Overbaugh, she has online courses. I have some. I know, oh my gosh, I am blanking right now. I know there's a couple other people. Mark Freeman, I think he does like group things. Not that I think he's more coming at it from a coaching perspective. But yeah, I think those are all, and I know internationally there's like OCD Excellence in the UK. I think there's a couple other folks, Scotland and Ireland. But yeah, it'd be great to have an actual international list, right? Because sometimes I have people
really
from India, from Germany. I'm like, I think you should reach out to people in your area. That'll be at least a little better fit.
So glad you pointed out those courses. I think it can be really tricky with all of the different books, courses, and things available. We're not always able to personally vet them. And so if someone has, it's really nice to hear that they've enjoyed them, see them as useful.
Yeah, those do 100%. Those I definitely will, at least I will say 100%, either of those go for. Also, Kristina counsels, Kristina Nabe, she has stuff on ICBT. We both have a course we did together on inference-based CBT, but her stuff is also really good if somebody wants that. Awesome. Okay. So I guess last question for you is, and I'm kind of throwing this at you, but if you were going to give like a moment of wisdom to pass on to somebody who is struggling or listening or like, oh my gosh, that's me. I deal with the morality stuff and other things, but whether that or just in general, like what would be something, a moment of hope or a nugget of wisdom or a technique or anything that comes to mind that you would like to leave people with?
I think the main thing that I want to say to someone who has moral scrupulosity is if your OCD is not being really well managed right now, you may be carrying the belief that you have done something or will do something or are doing something so icky that it will always sort of taint your life, your experience of self. You may be having a hard time seeing yourself as a lovable, caring, compassionate human who's offering a lot to this world. And if you're having a hard time with some of these thoughts, please know that through treatment, you might be able to get to know yourself in a new way that could be actually more real than what your OCD is telling you. And one of my favorite things about treating moral scrupulosity is these moments when the clouds in some ways start to part and people actually start really spending time with their actual authentic self, like actually seeing it and able to report back to me, essentially experiencing self-love for some of the first times in their life. And I guess I'll say is that's possible. And that is something worth fighting for. And that's something worth pursuing. And yeah. So anyway.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. And I know that we always want to kind of send a message of hope, but I think it is important to know it is possible, it is treatable. I mean, it does depend on where you're at and what you can access, but to know that yes, I love that having moments of sudden, or for the first time, even that self-love. I mean, I think that's wonderful.
Absolutely. And being able to approach these moments that used to be ridden with shame and being able to approach them and actually see who you are in the decision you're making and have pride in it. Like these are moments that are, and to feel like you're on solid footing, even with something that's tricky, like just moral questions are tricky, and to still have a sense of confidence in yourself as you approach that. It's just mind blowing. And I feel so lucky to be part of those moments. And, something I haven't said earlier that's just worth saying now, that the things I'm talking about today and the wisdom I have, of course, I've gotten from colleagues, but I get it from patients too. Like we learn so much as a community, and I am who I am in this field because of the ways people have opened themselves up in treatment and the progress they've made and the wonderful insights they've had about what worked for them.
I love it. So lastly, if people want to find you, how can they find you?
They can find me at my website, which is stonyrunpsych.com. I always like to spell that. STONYRUNPSYCH.com.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Kristina. And I really appreciate that you offered this podcast.